I invested $1,000 in Bitcoin and $1,000 in stocks. Here's what happened. There is no doubt that 2021 has been one of the best years for investors in a very long time. So when it comes to investing, the choices can be overwhelming because there are so many different ways to invest your money, from stocks, bonds, real estate, crypto, and even more exotic investments like watches, classic cars, wine, or even breeding exotic animals. There are so many ways to invest your hard-earned money, but most investors are always curious about two asset classes: stocks versus crypto. And which one of these should you pick? So with that being said, let's try this little experiment. I put $1,000 into stocks and $1,000 into Bitcoin. Let's see what happens. If you haven't seen my previous videos about my stock portfolio, here's a little bit of background information. For my $1,000 investment in stocks, I decided to go with Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. This ETF contains 508 stocks with a heavy concentration in technology companies. Since I already have a few other ETFs in my portfolio, I wanted to get more exposure to the technology sector. Another reason why I chose this ETF is because of its low expense ratio. For every $1,000 you invest, you only pay $1 in fees. So, if you invest $1 million, you only pay $1,000 in fees. So I decided to invest $1,000 in this ETF. However, since we're just doing a little experiment here, I went out and bought 20 shares of Tesla stock at an average price of $766 per share. When it comes to my $1,000 Bitcoin investment, I'm using Gemini Exchange to buy Bitcoin. And right now, $1,000 gives me a little over 0.03 Bitcoin. I've been using Gemini for quite some time and I've never had any issues with them. And their fees are pretty competitive. It cost me around $9 to buy 0.03 Bitcoin. So with my $1,000 investment, I ended up with a little over 0.03 Bitcoin. Now we have our investments ready to go. So let's fast forward a month and see how much money we made. A month later, as you can see, my 20 shares of Tesla stock are now worth $1,046. That means I made a profit of $46. However, we also need to take into account the $9 fees that I paid to purchase the stock. So after paying the fees, my total profit is $37. So that means my return on investment for my stock investment is 3.7%. And what about Bitcoin? Well, when I purchased my 0.03 Bitcoin, the total price was $759. And today, 0.03 Bitcoin is worth $993. That means I made a profit of $234. That is an unrealized gain of 31% in less than a month. It seems like Bitcoin is clearly the winner here. But wait a second. It's important to understand that gains from cryptocurrency are not locked in until you sell. As soon as you convert your Bitcoin back into dollars or any other currency, you will lock in your gains or, unfortunately, your losses. But what if I held on to my Bitcoin for another month? Let's find out. 2 months later? As you can see. And what about Bitcoin? Well, remember that 0.03 Bitcoin that I bought for $759? Well, today, it's worth $1,270. So that means I made a profit of $511. That's an unrealized gain of 67% in 2 months. So it looks like Bitcoin is still clearly the winner. But again, these gains are not locked in until I sell. 3 months later. As you can see, my 20 shares of Tesla stock have increased to $1,186. That means my total profit is now $186. And if we take into consideration the fees that I paid to buy the stock, my total profit would be around $177. That means my return on investment is now 17.7%. And what about Bitcoin? Well, remember that 0.03 Bitcoin that I bought for $759? Well, today it's worth $1,136. So that means I made a profit of $377. That's an unrealized gain of 50% in 3 months. So while my Bitcoin investment is still higher than my stock investment, the gains have started to slow down. 4 months later. As you can see, my 20 shares of Tesla stock have increased to $1,284. That means my total profit is now $284. And if we take into consideration the fees that I paid to buy the stock, my total profit would be around $275. That means my return on investment is now 27.5%. And what about Bitcoin? Well, remember that 0.03 Bitcoin that I bought for $759? Well, today it's worth $900. So that means I made a profit of $141. That's an unrealized gain of 18% in 4 months. So it looks like my stock investment has finally caught up to my Bitcoin investment 5 months later. As you can see, my 20 shares of Tesla stock have increased to $1,355. That means my total profit is now $355. And if we take into consideration the fees that I paid to buy the stock, my total profit would be around $346. That means my return on investment is now 34.6%. And what about Bitcoin? Well, remember that 0.03 Bitcoin that I bought for $759? Well, today it's worth $825. So that means I made a profit of $56. That's an unrealized gain of 7% in 5 months. So it looks like my stock investment is starting to pull ahead of my Bitcoin investment. 6 months later, as you can see. And what about Bitcoin? Well, remember that 0.03 Bitcoin that I bought for $759? Well, today it's worth $785. So that means I made a profit of $46. That's an unrealized gain of 6% in 6 months. So it looks like my stock investment has pulled even further ahead of my Bitcoin investment. So based on these results, it looks like my $1,000 stock investment performed better than my $1,000 Bitcoin investment. However, it's important to remember that Bitcoin is a much more volatile investment. So, theoretically, I could have sold my Bitcoin at the peak and made a lot more money. On the other hand, I could have also sold my stocks at the peak and made a lot more money. So, which one of these investments is better? Well, that depends on your individual circumstances and what you're trying to accomplish with your investments. For example, if you're looking for a more stable investment, then stocks may be a better option. However, if you're looking for a higher potential return, then Bitcoin may be a better option. That being said, I personally prefer to diversify my investments across different asset classes. So I don't put all my eggs in one basket. If you'd like to learn more about my stock portfolio, check out this video.